Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Avoidants are often misunderstood in relationships. On the surface, they seem like people who crave independence, space, and emotional distance. They can come across as cold, detached, or even indifferent, especially when intimacy starts to deepen. In romantic dynamics, this often leads to one partner pursuing closeness while the avoidant partner withdraws. Here's the paradox that catches most people off guard. Avoidance craves space until it's actually given to them. When someone finally gives an avoidant the space they seem to be begging for, especially through something like no contact, it flips an emotional switch they weren't prepared for. Suddenly, the silence they once needed feels loud. The distance they once fought for feels like abandonment. And the person they pushed away is no longer chasing them, no longer accessible, no longer feeding their silent need for control. What felt like safety now feels like loss. You have to understand that avoidants are not emotionally numb. They are emotionally defended. There's a difference. Their fear isn't that they don't want love. It's that love feels unsafe. They want connection, but they want it on their terms. They want to be close, but not too close. And they want to feel wanted without feeling smothered. So when things get intense or emotionally vulnerable, they pull away. It's their way of maintaining control, of protecting their own emotional equilibrium. But this strategy has a major blind spot. It only works when the other person keeps showing up. The moment you stop showing up, when you go silent, stop texting, stop checking in, and especially when you go fully no contact, it's like you take away their anchor. Even if they once resented your emotional presence, they'd grown used to it. It served a role in their life, even if they didn't admit it out loud. You were the one who kept the connection going, who held the emotional weight of the relationship. When that disappears, it's not just inconvenient for them, it's disorienting. What's fascinating is that this disorientation can quickly turn into obsession. Avoidants are slow to recognize their feelings in real time, but absence creates clarity. When you're gone, they finally have the mental and emotional space to confront what they've been avoiding all along. That you mattered, that they miss you, and that maybe they even love you. But now, you're not there to receive it, and that stirs something powerful inside them: curiosity, regret, longing. It's not uncommon for them to check your social media, replay old conversations, analyze your last words, and even fantasize about reaching out. And all of this happens in the same mental space where they once told themselves they didn't need you. And this isn't just romantic nostalgia. It's a breakdown of their emotional defense system. When the person they pushed away suddenly disappears from their life without drama, begging, or closure, the avoidant mind starts to spin. Why aren't they chasing me? Did I misread the situation? What if they never come back? That kind of uncertainty becomes addictive. The power dynamic they once relied on is gone, and in its place is a gaping emotional wound they didn't see coming. Ironically, the very space they wanted becomes the thing they can't tolerate. And that's the trap of the avoidant style. They run from intimacy to protect themselves, but when intimacy disappears completely, it triggers the very panic they were trying to avoid. The silence forces them to reflect, to feel, and to finally confront the parts of themselves they usually numb or ignore. That's why so many avoidants come back after no contact, not because they've changed overnight, but because they're being haunted by the very emotions they tried to suppress. In this way, no contact becomes a mirror. It shows avoidants what life is like without the emotional safety net they took for granted. It invites them to feel their own emotional hunger and their fear of true vulnerability. They may not say it outright. They may still pretend they're fine, post pictures to look unbothered, or even date other people to distract themselves. But beneath all of that, many are stuck in a loop of quiet addiction, watching, wondering, and longing for the connection they once dismissed. And that's the irony. Avoidants crave space until it's finally given to them. Then they realize it's not the space they needed, it was healing, safety, and emotional maturity, but they don't know how to ask for those things directly. So they obsess, they linger, and more often than not, they come back not because they need space again, but because your absence became louder than their fear. Avoidants often move through relationships appearing calm, collected, and even emotionally indifferent. They tend to maintain a wall between themselves and others, not out of cruelty, but as a form of emotional protection. They've learned, often from early life experiences, that getting too close to someone can lead to pain, rejection, or engulfment. So they keep people at a distance to stay safe. But the moment you detach, truly detach, and go no contact, something unexpected happens. It triggers a deep, often subconscious fear they've been trying to outrun their entire lives, the fear of abandonment. While it might seem like avoidants don't care when you pull away, the truth is far more complex. Their initial response may look indifferent or even relieved, as if your absence makes their life simpler. But underneath that facade, a powerful emotional process begins to unfold. You see, for all their avoidance of closeness, they still form attachments. They still care. They just don't always know how to show it, or they feel unsafe expressing it. When you were in their life, you were providing emotional consistency, even if the relationship was rocky. You were available, you were present, and in many ways, you were emotionally anchoring them, even if they wouldn't acknowledge it. The moment you detach, especially if you do so without begging, pleading, or creating chaos, it disorients them. Their mind starts to race with unspoken questions. Where did they go? Why aren't they chasing me? Did they stop caring? These questions aren't just about ego. They strike at the very core of an avoidant's hidden emotional blueprint. Despite their efforts to seem unaffected, detachment reminds them of something primal. The fear that once someone gets close enough to truly see them, they will eventually leave. For many avoidants, abandonment is a wound that formed early. Maybe they had inconsistent caregivers, emotionally unavailable parents, or were taught that expressing needs would lead to rejection. So they developed a coping mechanism, emotional self-sufficiency. They told themselves they didn't need anyone, but that was a lie they had to believe in order to protect themselves from the pain of not getting their needs met. As adults, when someone gets too close, it activates that old wound. And when that person leaves, especially without trauma, it doesn't just feel like space. It feels like confirmation of their deepest fear, that people always leave. Your calm detachment is not just silence, it's a mirror. It shows them the very thing they're terrified of facing, that love can disappear, that people can walk away, and that connection can fade without warning. This makes them question their choices, their behavior, and most painfully, their assumptions about intimacy. It's not that they want you back because they've suddenly become secure. It's that your distance unearthed something inside them that they haven't processed. This is why, after a period of no contact, many avoidants start showing signs of what looks like addiction. They may not reach out directly at first, but they'll linger in the background, watching your stories, liking old posts, asking mutual friends about you. These subtle moves are their way of maintaining some thread of connection without risking rejection. They're trying to soothe the fear that's been triggered without having to fully face it or admit vulnerability. What they don't realize is that the more they try to manage that fear through avoidance or passive behavior, the more it controls them. Detachment forces them to confront the reality that connection isn't guaranteed. It must be nurtured, reciprocated, and respected. And if they don't take responsibility for their part in pushing you away, they will continue to relive the same cycle over and over. Your detachment then becomes a wake-up call. It shows them what happens when someone chooses themselves, when someone stops playing the emotional caretaker, when someone refuses to beg for breadcrumbs of affection. This disruption is jarring for the avoidant, but it's also transformative. It's often the first time they're forced to feel the very abandonment they've worked so hard to avoid. And once that fear is activated, it doesn't go away easily. It lingers in their subconscious, coloring their thoughts, their memories, and their emotions about you. They may try to numb it, they may dive into distractions, date someone new, or convince themselves they've moved on. But the fear stays. Because it's not just about losing you. It's about being faced with the pain they never healed. And that pain, once triggered by your detachment, becomes a quiet but persistent reminder of what they never dealt with. That's why they become so fixated, because your silence says what words never could. You're not in control anymore. And now you have to feel. Avoidant individuals often rely heavily on control to feel safe in relationships. This isn't always obvious at first. It can look like independence, emotional coolness, or even just needing space. But beneath the surface, what's really happening is an attempt to manage vulnerability. Control becomes their armor, their way of regulating how close someone can get, how much emotion is shared, and how much risk they're willing to take. They thrive when they can set the pace of intimacy, when they can lean in just enough to feel connection and then pull away before it feels threatening. This push and pull dynamic gives them a sense of emotional safety, but it also creates imbalance. And when you go no contact, that balance is completely shattered. The dynamic they've been relying on, the one where they subtly hold emotional power, breaks down. And that breakdown forces them into unfamiliar territory. Before no contact, they knew what to expect. You were probably the one reaching out more, trying to connect, offering emotional support, and attempting to bridge the growing distance. They may not have openly acknowledged this, but on some level, they counted on it. Your presence, your reassurance, your willingness to stay, even when they pulled away, all of it became part of the control system they had in place. They didn't have to fully show up because they knew you would. They didn't have to risk vulnerability because you were doing enough emotional labor for both of you. So when you stop, when you walk away and go silent, it shakes their internal foundation. No contact is not just about cutting communication. It's about removing the energy, attention, and emotional consistency that they had come to rely on. Even if they never asked for it directly, they were using it as a cushion. The moment that cushion is gone, the emotional ground beneath them starts to feel unstable. Suddenly, they can't predict your next move. They can't lean back on the unspoken assumption that you'll always be there. And for someone who depends on control to feel emotionally safe, that unpredictability is incredibly triggering. Without realizing it, avoidants often use control to avoid emotional chaos. It's not about manipulating others in a malicious way. It's about preventing themselves from feeling overwhelmed. They may ghost when things get too intense, withdraw after moments of closeness, or become vague and non-committal. These behaviors create just enough space for them to breathe. But when you stop chasing, you take that space and make it permanent. Now they're left with silence they didn't initiate and can't control. That's when the inner tension begins. At first, they may try to convince themselves that your silence means nothing. They may tell themselves you were too emotional, too needy, or that they're better off without the drama. But as time passes and they realize you're not coming back, not reaching out, not checking in, not feeding their emotional control, they start to spiral internally. The loss of control doesn't just make them uncomfortable, it makes them question their narrative. Because if you're truly gone, if you've truly moved on, then the dynamic has changed permanently. And that means they can't return to the relationship on their terms anymore. This loss of control often creates a desperate need to reestablish contact, even if subtly. They may send a vague message, watch your stories, or like a post, just to see if you'll respond. These small gestures are not random. They're attempts to see if they can regain even a small sense of control. But when you hold the line and stay silent, it sends a clear message. The rules have changed. You're no longer participating in the old dynamic. You're no longer giving your power away. And that's both terrifying and oddly magnetic to an avoidant. Because on a deeper level, avoidants don't truly want control. They want safety. They just don't know how to find it without trying to manage intimacy. When no contact takes away their ability to do that, they're left with only themselves. That self-reflection can be painful. It forces them to confront why they felt the need to control things in the first place. It brings their emotional wounds to the surface, the ones they've worked hard to suppress. And in that discomfort, many begin to fixate on you, not just as a lost partner, but as the person who disrupted the illusion of control they had depended on for so long. So when you go no contact, it's not just silence, it's a shift in power. You're no longer reacting to their behavior. You're no longer playing the emotional caretaker. And for the first time, they're left to deal with the consequences of their own distance. That disruption is where the real emotional impact begins. Not because they suddenly became different people, but because you stop playing a role in their pattern. And without that pattern, they're no longer in control. When you go no contact with an avoidant, something very powerful begins to happen. Something that they may not even consciously understand. What once felt familiar, predictable, and maybe even taken for granted suddenly becomes mysterious. The person they assumed would always be there, checking in, forgiving, showing up, has gone quiet. And that silence, that unknown, creates a kind of emotional mystery that avoidants find deeply irresistible. Avoidants tend to operate in a space where they keep others at arm's length. They don't want to reveal too much of themselves, and they often struggle with emotional transparency. As a result, they feel more in control when they're the ones creating the distance. But the moment you remove yourself from the equation entirely, the script flips. You become the unknown variable, the one they can't read anymore, the one they can't predict or influence. And in the space where they once felt superior or detached, a new feeling begins to grow. Curiosity. That curiosity can start small. Maybe they wonder what you're up to or why you haven't reached out. Maybe they notice the lack of your usual messages and feel a slight pang of discomfort. But over time, if you remain silent, that curiosity intensifies. Avoidants are used to being the ones who disappear, not the ones left behind. When you break the pattern and stop giving them access to you, they begin to romanticize your presence. They replay your words, rethink your value, and slowly start building a fantasy around who you were. Because now, you're no longer available to remind them of reality. The human mind is wired to fill in gaps. And when someone who was once emotionally accessible goes completely quiet, those gaps become wide open. The avoidant starts projecting. Maybe they imagine you've moved on. Maybe they think you're happier without them. Maybe they wonder if someone else is giving you the attention they withheld. Each unanswered question adds to the mystery, and each bit of silence becomes fuel for emotional obsession. What was once predictable becomes an enigma. And enigmas are hard to let go of. This effect is amplified by the fact that you're no longer feeding their need for reassurance. Avoidants don't typically ask for validation directly, but they absorb it through your presence, through the way you consistently showed care, reached out, and stayed available even when they pulled away. When all of that is gone, it creates a void, but rather than face the loss head-on, avoidants often find themselves pulled into the mystery of your absence. It becomes a puzzle they can't stop trying to solve. What makes this even more powerful is that you're not doing anything to provoke it. You're not begging for attention. You're not trying to prove your worth. You're not explaining yourself over and over again. You've gone quiet, and in doing so, you've become something they can't grasp. And that's intoxicating to someone who's used to being in control. The less they know about what's going on in your world, the more they want to know, the more they wonder, the more they stalk your social media or ask mutual friends about you. Because mystery disrupts their internal narrative. It forces them to feel when they'd rather think. It forces them to imagine when they'd rather avoid. At the core of it, the mystery you create becomes a mirror. It shows them everything they didn't fully appreciate while you were there. They remember your kindness, your patience, your emotional presence, but now it's wrapped in uncertainty. They don't know if they can get it back. They don't know if you'd even answer. And that uncertainty becomes addictive. They become drawn to the idea of you, the fantasy of you, the emotional imprint you left behind. Avoidants rarely process emotions in real time. They often realize the depth of their feelings only after the connection has been severed. No contact deprives them of immediate access to you, and that deprivation triggers a delayed emotional reaction. But instead of admitting vulnerability outright, they become fixated. You become the what if, the maybe, the one that got away, not because you changed, but because you disappeared. That's the paradox. By stepping away, you become more powerful in their mind. Your silence becomes louder than words. Your absence becomes more present than your presence ever was. And the mystery of who you are now, how you're feeling, who you're with, whether you've healed or moved on, becomes something they can't ignore. They may not say it, and they may not show it, but the mystery pulls at them constantly because people don't obsess over what's available. They obsess over what's out of reach.